Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Assalamu alaikum, wherever you're joining us from. Welcome everybody to MACFEST 2023. Please tell us in the chat where you're joining us from. From me, it's hello from France. The rest of our team is based in the UK. My name is Katarzyna, and today we've got a wonderful event with Diabulo Cipangura. During the event, please feel free to send your comments in the chat and share any questions and any thoughts you might have. You can also post your questions in the Q&A portal. And on behalf of MACFEST, I'd like to thank everybody for your generous donations, big and small. We appreciate all of them because they help us create more events for you in MACFEST 2024. Most of them are free. So really thank you very much. Please follow MACFEST and Muslim Women's Arts Foundation on social media. We're on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn, and TikTok. And do use our hashtag #SpreadHoney, Before I tell a few words about Jabu, I'd like to just invite you for our upcoming event tomorrow, same time on Zoom, a wonderful event about Muslim women in Australia. And then we've got another event. If you happen to be in the UK on 1st of July, we've got a great live event in Manchester, in Salford. You probably know the event space, the Lowry. Please do check Eventbrite. We've put the whole event with the description. Okay, so now let me tell you a few words just very quickly about Jabu. He holds a PhD in anthropology from the University of Witwatersrand in Johannesburg, South Africa, and he's the curator of living culture at Manchester Museum, which is a part of University of Manchester. As a curator of living cultures, he is responsible for the care of more than 25,000 objects from Africa, Asia, Oceania, and the Americas, as well as building new research and forming relationships and collaborations. Jabu has interest in empirical ways by which the museum practice can be decolonized through epistemic and aesthetic disobedience benchmarked by undoing earlier ways of knowledge production in collections and exhibitions practices. He has published more than a dozen research papers that looks at ongoing debates around the coloniality of museums and associated knowledge production and representation practices to imagine decolonized museums in Africa. So I've got a list of different articles and different journals here, and perhaps we will have a little bit of time to talk about them. He also contributed to a number of books, which I would love to ask about a little bit later. And he's also a board member of the Collections Committee and International Council of Museums, and also he sits on the board of Kojan Arts and Humanities Journal, where he is the editor of Museums and Heritage Studies. Okay, over to you, Jabu.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, good evening, depending from where you are. My name is Diabulo Cipangura. I'm joining you from Berlin, but I'm the curator of living cultures at Manchester Museum. I'll share my slides and all right. So thank you very much for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be presenting for this year's edition of the MACFEST. Jabu is my name, in short, Diabulo Cipangura. I'm a social cultural anthropologist and currently the curator of living cultures at Manchester Museum, which is part of the University of Manchester. So I'm going to speak to you today about decolonial practices in museums. Decolonization has become a buzzword, I think, in academia. So what does it mean for Manchester Museum to be practicing decolonial work in relationship to the Islamic material culture that we hold at Manchester Museum? The title of my talk is Decolonizing Islamic Ethnographic Collections at Manchester Museum within the context of collaborations, care, and inclusion. So perhaps just a bit of more about myself and what I do at the Manchester Museum. So I'm curator. I've been in post for the past two years. Before my appointment to the curatorship position at Manchester Museum, I was a lecturer of social cultural anthropology at the University of the Witwatersrand in Johannesburg. I also teach social anthropology at the University of Manchester as part of the curatorial work. I did some postdoctoral research in South Africa between 2019 and 2021. I'm the author of a book called Museums as Agents of Social Change, Collaborative Programs. It's Mutare Museum. And to move my next slide. All right, so I'll start off with the research problem in terms of thinking about decolonial work in museums, in particular looking at Manchester Museum. So the problem is Manchester Museum is part of what we call encyclopedic museums. So encyclopedic museums houses thousands of cultural objects from different parts of the world. And we're currently grappling with problematic histories of appropriation, dispossession, looting, and the containment of these objects in museums, which came as a result of colonial violence. The expansion of the British Empire to Africa, Oceania, the Americas, and Asia during colonization resulted in the appropriation of cultural objects that found their ways into the museum. The problem is that these encyclopedic museums like Manchester classified and categorized cultural objects in accordance to disciplinary configurations of archaeology, anthropology, ethnology, ethnography, which resulted in the ignoring of the social biographies of the objects themselves. So much more than thinking about an object, these objects are representing living cultures and biographies, which are not there when the objects were collected. So secret, sacred, ritual, and ceremonial objects from Africa, from Asia, from the Oceania, from the Americas were ordered in accordance to Western ways of doing, which we erased and ignored indigenous epistemologies and ontologies. So this is the problem that we're sitting over. An encyclopedic museum with a huge collection of ethnographic objects from different parts of the world, which don't have, in most cases, biographies. It's just the anthropological category of keeping and
I think we're having some technical issue. And Jabu, I think your connection has... Yeah, are you back? Can you hear us?
Yeah.
Okay, great. We just lost you for a moment.
Oh, sorry about that. So the other question is, how can we carry out provenance research with communities whose cultural objects we have at Manchester? That's the first problem. The second question is around how can we achieve inclusivity and care in respect of building active relationships between our collections and communities whose cultures we hold. The third question is, what does an empirical practice of decolonizing these collections at Manchester Museum look like? Then last question, how do we reorder dispossessed cultural objects curatorially in ways that unsettle conventional ordering of objects, right? By creating space for lived experiences and indigenous knowledges. So the Manchester Museum is part of the University of Manchester. It's one of the largest university museums in the UK, if not the largest. We have more than 4.5 million cultural and natural objects that we care for on behalf of communities, of course. So the concept of living cultures, I'm curator of living cultures, is a recognition that the anthropological collection that I'm responsible for is not just objects as per se, but they are living cultures representing living cultural practices from where the objects were looted in most cases or collected from during colonization. So I'm responsible for roughly around 25,000 ethnographic objects from Africa, Asia, Oceania, and the Americas, divided according to the following geographic regions. Africa is approximately 12,000 objects. Asia is approximately 4,500 objects. The Americas is approximately 4,000 objects. The Oceania is approximately 7,000 objects. And we also have women remains from Africa, Oceania, and America. But I couldn't really give out the figure of the human remains because we are rethinking the category of human remains, which is very problematic. These are not human remains, these are ancestors of living people, and they were collected and ethically as trophies of the conquest. Most of what we hold as human remains are ancestors of living people that were colonized, defeated during colonial wars, and then they were taken as trophies, and we have them in the museum. So we're rethinking this whole category of human remains and thinking about them as ancestors and trying to rehumanize them, and perhaps think about how we can ethically repatriate and return these ancestors back to Africa, the Oceanias, to the America, or to Asia. The other thing that I want to underscore here is this use of the word approximately. Approximately means that we have more than 12,000, for example, from Africa. So we're still sitting over other unprovenanced objects from Africa. We're waiting to do research that will establish where from Africa these collections came from. So Africa, for example, I'm just using Africa as an example. It's not a country, right? It's a continent. So there are many other collections from Africa that we have that you don't see on this number. There are many other objects waiting to be researched and to be provenanced to search and trace where exactly from Africa these objects come from. So we're sitting over maybe more than 27,000 objects, because some of them are not provenanced. So that's a question that I want to open up for discussion later on. How do we collaborate with communities in Manchester or around the UK in doing biographical research on unprovenanced objects that we have in the museum? So we recently reopened, those of you in Manchester, we opened on the 18th of February after undergoing a major capital development project called Hello Future. So when we opened on the 18th, we opened with new galleries, interesting galleries that were co-produced mostly by communities around Manchester. We've got the China Cultural Gallery, it's a new gallery. We've got the South Asia Gallery, which is a partnership with the British Museum. We've got the Belonging Gallery. We've got the Reimagined African Collections Gallery. So all of these are new co-produced galleries that are at Manchester Museum, which were not there previously. And in the spirit of collaborations, inclusion, and caring for objects beyond them being materialities, we're now working actively with diaspora communities who are helping us to rethink and re-narrate the stories of the objects in exhibitions through co-production and co-curatorship, which is a decolonial methodology. So collaborations mean that we are working actively with communities from Africa, diasporans or source communities from Asia, from the Oceania, who are helping us to reinterpret or to re-narrate stories of the objects. Caring is an acknowledgement of the role that colonial violence played in structuring our anthropological collections and what it means to care not only for the objects, but for people's cultural practices that are embedded in the material culture that we hold at Manchester Museum. And then inclusivity underscores a commitment for greater collaboration, co-production, co-curatorship by foregrounding diverse perspectives from different ontologies or different perspectives of communities. And we also do what we call truth-telling and disclosure, which means that we have to tell our communities what we hold at Manchester Museum, because in most cases, people don't even know that we are sitting over 25,000 ethnographic objects. So by opening up our collections to our communities, they'll be able to see what we hold, then we can co-produce new narratives or new meanings of the objects. And then lastly, there's what we call unconditional repatriations. We also aim to return cultural objects that were ethical and ethically acquired back to Africa, back to Australia, back to communities in Asia, back to the Americas. So we are engaging with communities whose objects we hold with the hope that we might aid the process of repatriating or returning some of the cultural objects. And in 2019, we returned 43 secret sacred ceremonial objects back to Australia. So this is what we're doing in terms of trying to engage with communities, which would lead to the repatriation of unethically acquired cultural materials. So we reopened with the new galleries, and so far since we reopened, we've welcomed more than. Can I proceed?
Yes, you can.
Okay. So far since we reopened, we've welcomed more than 300,000 visitors to Manchester Museum since the 18th of February. One of the most interesting galleries that we have now, which speaks directly to South Asia heritage, is called the South Asia Gallery. This was co-produced by Manchester Museum, British Museum, and a collective of 23 South Asia diaspora community members who live in Manchester. The South Asia Gallery presents a compelling history of South Asia heritage and British history as well, in terms of thinking about diasporans and how they relate with the cultural material that are at Manchester Museum. It's the first permanent gallery in the UK to celebrate the experiences and contributions of South Asia diasporans. So what I want to underscore here is this idea of co-production and co-curatorship. There's a lead curator for the South Asia Gallery, my colleague Nusrat Ahmed. She was responsible for coordinating or bringing together a collective of co-curators who were able to tell their own stories about South Asia heritage. That in itself is a decolonial practice. We're no longer having curators as the experts per se. Curators are now facilitating conversations or dialogue, right? So communities can be able to tell their own stories in museums. So we see that as a form of care, as a form of decolonizing the museum. It's a movement away from treating curatorship as a domain of expertise. Curatorship can be practiced from multivocality or multiple perspectives. People can come through the museum and curate their own stories from their own heritages. That's the story of the South Asia Gallery. We have those of you who have been to Manchester Gallery, we commissioned an artist from Bangladesh to come and do the installation, and they make the construction, literally the building up of the rickshaw. We have 2 of these pieces. One of them will be hired off to people who want to use it for celebrations of special events, which also shows the idea of living cultures within the museum space. This is a living cultural object. It's not just an object in a museum, but you can hide out and use it as a living cultural object. So that's part of the ways in which we're trying to make the museum open and a socially engaged space where we can have a relationship between people and their collections. Then the China Culture Gallery draws on the historical links between Manchester and China, using a variety of perspectives from Chinese diasporans. It offers a diverse and dynamic understanding of China culture. We collaborated with the Manchester China Institute in coming up with a showcase of China living cultures. A lot of the stories are told in Chinese, and new meanings were generated from a diaspora Chinese perspective. Again, it's moving away from authoritarian presentation of China culture at the museum.
It's okay.
I don't know if my connection is dropping. So I was speaking about the China Culture Gallery as one part of a co-produced gallery between curators at Manchester Museum and the Manchester China Institute, as well as Chinese diasporians who were telling stories about China cultures and in their own perspective. So it's part of this idea of decolonizing the museum by working and collaborating with communities whose cultural objects we hold. The Belonging Gallery is another example again of how this gallery draws from collections and multiple cultural perspectives that reflect on how we come to know what belonging means for ourselves, other people, species, and plants. It tells stories about humans, animals, plants, and how they've lived together harmoniously with one another in different landscapes. Methodologically, we've used comic illustrations drawn from 20 local, national, and international artists to tell the story of belonging. We also explore how we experience belonging through relationships with everyday objects, places, movements, and actions. And then the other work that we've been doing is working with communities in South Africa. So we did a collaborative provenance research with colleagues in South Africa, a museum called Dison Cultural History Museum, where we were working towards thinking about the meaning of a collection of beads that came from KwaZulu-Natal. So as part of the research, I went to South Africa to do collaboration in terms of understanding the meanings of the beads with communities who are still making and using similar beads that we have at Manchester Museum. So as a result of this research, we're going to come up with a new exhibition at Manchester Museum that is going to be called Stories of the Zulu Beadwork. So this is the colleague of mine who is in South Africa, who I was collaborating with in remaking or rethinking the meaning of the beadwork that we have at Manchester Museum. So she's working at Dison Cultural History Museum in Pretoria, and they also have an almost similar collection of beadwork that we have at Manchester Museum, which tells you the story of how museums, not only in the UK, were complicit in acquiring and taking cultural objects from communities and placing them in museums as buildings. So in Africa, for example, we have these big museums that were established during colonization that also appropriated and looted people's cultural objects with no meaning whatsoever. So there's a relationship between how museums in Africa were built as offshoots of colonization and museums that we have in Europe, which were also appropriating and taking over cultural objects from African communities. So that's part of the work, the beadwork, analyzing. So this is the collection at Manchester Museum. But what was not there were the meanings of this piece. They were just seen as beadwork in the collections. But we didn't really know the meaning that this beadwork would carry from where they were made and how they are used by communities in everyday cultural practices. And up until the point we did the research in KwaZulu-Natal. So part of the gallery, this is just an artistic impression of how the gallery will look like. We'll have beadwork, and then we have stories of the bead. We're going to have a story about how beads are used as a representation of love, how beads are also used in healing practices, how beads are used for symbolism, how the beads are used for contemporary meanings. So all of these are new stories that are coming through from the collaborative research that we had with community members in KwaNongoma in South Africa. Now I'm moving on to the Islamic material culture that we have at Manchester Museum, which is going to be the central focus of this talk. So we don't think of this as, this is about from Asia. It's categorized as Persian and perhaps from Iran. And again, this is very open to more nuanced researches, because when people are collecting these objects, they're just collecting them. Sometimes they would really put wrong geographical categorization, because they're just appropriating and somewhat looting these cultural objects from communities. So we got this bowl from a donor called Mr. Arnold Forrester, and it was deposited in the museum in 1964. So it shows, as you can see from the picture, a band of vegetal decoration comprising of repeated leaf pairs on a pierced ground, which is inside from the interior. The exterior is not decorated apart from the piercing marks that you can perhaps see. It has a layer of covers over the perforations, creating glassy window and gathering thick 2/3 of the way down the exterior. So that's the description that was given by the collectors then. But my call for action as I do this presentation is not just about this bowl as looking aesthetically beautiful. We're looking for the meanings of these bowls. What were these bowls used for? From where they were collected from? That's where the idea of living cultures kicks into play. We're not worried about the aesthetic value, the aesthetic beauty of this bowl. We need to know the underlying stories of how and why these material cultures were used and how they're still being used from an Islamic perspective. So this we can do by collaborating with communities who might still have knowledge around the meaning and the making of similar bowels. And then we have these shoes. And from our register, there's Turkey, and Turkey is in a quotation, it's in a question mark, which means we might not know exactly whether these shoes were collected from Turkey. So it's a question open for discussion and open for more collaborative research to really establish whether these shoes were collected from Turkey. They were donated from the Southport Museum in 1969, so they came to be part of the Living Cultures collection in 1969 as a result of a donation from Southport Museum. It's a pair comprising of two shoes, wooden shoes. Beneath each of the sole is an invented V-shaped support, which lifts the sole of the shoes high from the ground. The support and the soles are behind a pew shell. So all of the descriptions suits what the collectors were seeing when they were collecting the objects. But the question again is, how do we make sure that we get more narratives or more stories around this pair of shoes collected from Asia, and Turkey has been given as a country. But again, there's a question mark in our record, which means we need to do more research to establish whether they came from Turkey or from other countries within the Asian region. The other collection that we have is Turkey scissors, which were dated to be from between 1750 to around 1899. This is a calligrapher scissors of iron inlaid with gold. These scissors have long, narrow blades and handles with the cut of the word or openia, one of the 99 names of the gods. The calligrapher thus acknowledges God's influence over his or her everyday action, and the fine quality of the tools reflects the care taken in every aspect of the calligrapher's process. These scissors would originally have formed part of a set and also include a pen cutting slab, burnishing tool, knife, and a pen case, possibly incorporating an ink as well. They were used to cut paper to the size required by the calligrapher. The inscription, Ya Fatah, meaning all open of doors, is also on the calligrapher, on the scissors. And then Fatah is one of the 99 names used for God. This is the description that we hear from the anthropological meaning, right? When these objects are collected. But it's open to interpretation. It's also open to different ways of knowing and doing, as of when communities can also give us a new interpretation of the object. So not only thinking about this as anthropological objects, they're living cultures, and we can generate even new meanings from what we have already in our record as a form of collaborating with communities who might have knowledge around this pair of scissors. Then we've got a candlestick, which is dated from between 14th and 15th century. And many Muslim potters from a region called Nasrid, south of Spain, would have made this kind of candlestick. They were integrated into the Christian culture, while perhaps maintaining the original Islamic ceramic motif from where it was made in South Spain or Valencia. It's mainly associated with the Valencian town of Manís. These wares were decorated with a range of floral and geometric motifs. They were widely exported to Italy, France, England, and sometimes commissioned by noble families whose insignia were incorporated into the designs. Over time, the Italian imitations and innovations included Malocchia, which came to dominate the market, and the quality of the Valencian glassware declined. This candlestick probably dates between 17th or 18th century, when decorations became characterized by deeply brass red tones to the luster and simplified patterns that covered the majority of the available space. So we have this again from our Living Cultures collection, connected to the Islamic cultural tradition. The core again is about thinking together how we can, maybe beyond just thinking about the motifs that we see on the candlestick, what do we think in terms of connecting this candlestick to living cultures? And do we have Islamic traditions that are existing today, which are still making similar candlestick that we can build upon to get more biographical meanings of this candlestick? And then this dish is labeled, from the collection is labeled an Islamic dish. Nothing more, just an Islamic dish. So more provenance information is required. This dish was collected from. We don't know exactly where it came from. That's the truth. It's only written in Islamic dish. So we're hoping to, from this engagement, we're hoping to open up more information about the dish, apart from just labeling it an Islamic dish. And then we've got this bowl, a dark brown bowl with some trellis decorations. It's labeled Islamic bowl, and perhaps the label has Morocco and North Africa in question mark. So we're still grappling with the question of how do we really get to understand the real provenance of this object? Because we don't really know whether it's from Morocco, whether it's from Tunisia, whether it's from Algeria, whether it's from Egypt. So these are questions that I want to open up for broader discussion in terms of collaborating with communities of Islamic heritage who can help us to understand together where such kind of bowls are still being made or produced within the Islamic world. And then we have this cup, an open cup with two side handles. It is painted dark brown with some geometric designs that resembles human figures. It looks like there's an outstretched arm on the upper section of each of the chamber of the pot. There's a flat base. Again, on the label, as you can see from the label, it's written probably Morocco. Open to discussion again, open to more collaborative provenance research to establish really from where in Morocco this object was collected from. So there's need for more biographical research to get to understand the full story of this cup. And then edition the bowl in the collection, just labeled edition the bowl. We're still doing more research to establish where exactly this object came from within the Islamic world. Probably Middle East, that's what the label say, probably Middle East, but Middle East is a very big region. So as curators, we're working together, thinking together with communities with an Islamic heritage background, how we can try to populate missing biographical information about this dish and bowl that we hold at Manchester Museum. Then I'm switching off a bit from the Islamic cultural material to speak about the other work that we've been doing in terms of repatriating cultural material back to different communities. So we have material from Nigeria, and most famously the Benin cultural material. Benin was a very famous kingdom in Nigeria, which was looted significantly by the British soldiers in 1897, and they brought with them a large chunk of this loot found in almost every ethnographic museum in the UK and in America. So we do have material culture from Benin at Manchester Museum. We've been proactively thinking about how to return these cultural materials back to Benin in Nigeria. One of the materials is this task that you can see in the picture here. It used to be in one of our display galleries called the Living Worlds. But after understanding the proper context of how this object came, telling them the context around how the task was acquired. And we did an open book kind of methodology where we asked the visitors what they think about this task, what we should do as a museum. And 99% or 95%, should I say, overwhelmingly said to us, we need to return this task to Nigeria. It doesn't belong to the museum. It's not yours. It was stolen. So what am I saying about this approach? Unconditional repatriations can also be an initiative towards which museums decolonize themselves by opening, telling those, and then facilitating the return of these materials to source communities, just like in the case of the Benin task, which we're going to be, hopefully, we're going to be repatriating back to Nigeria, to the community. The other work that we've been doing on the Benin material is digitization of the material culture and allowing the Benin cultural material to be seen online. So there's a project called Digital Benin, which I've been part of. We submitted images of digital Benin material that we have at Manchester Museum. Close to 19 objects are now online, so you can easily access them online and check the other countries or the other museums in the UK that have Benin material. So it's called digital repatriation, which means people can still have access to their materials online. And perhaps that will lead to them laying claims on what they want to have back from museums in Europe. So at least it's an initiative trying to be open to disclose what we hold and allowing communities to see online as a form of digital repatriation. The other work that we've been doing, again, we speak to this idea of trying to retain cultural objects back to communities. It's a work that I'm doing with communities in Australia. We do have an impressive collection of cultural material collected from Northern Australia from a community called andtheir. So last summer, I went to do a research with the communities, just showing them the materials that we hold through photography and whether they want to have these materials back from Manchester Museum. And most of the community elders were enthusiastic about having back their cultural objects back to Australia. That again shows us that if museums can be able to practice truth-telling, go beyond the walls of a museum, go to the communities, tell them what we hold, then we can facilitate the process of returning the material back to the communities. Otherwise, they won't know what we hold if we don't tell them what we hold. It will always be a question of having more than 35,000 objects in the museum. And what we see in exhibition is only maybe a fraction. By proactively facilitating dialogue around the repatriation of cultural objects to communities. That's part of the work, working with these indigenous communities in Australia. And interestingly, most of what we hold in the museum, most of the objects that we have, they're still making similar objects. Like in this picture, a senior elder was showing me how they're still using fishing sticks, right, to do fishing. And we have a lot of these fishing sticks in our collections, which means that these are living cultural objects. They don't die because they're now in a museum. They're still an active cultural practice that is connected to this materiality that we have in museums. So returning them back to communities will help in creating cultural revitalizations, as these are living cultural objects that are still being actively made and used by communities. All right, I think this is my last slide, and I now open up to questions, discussions, and any other contribution towards the living culture material at Manchester Museum, specifically the Islamic collections. But we do have more than the Islamic collections. We do have many other cultural material that I've spoken about in this presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jabu. I've not seen any questions from the public. So I've got one question for you. How come you chose this direction in life? Was it something in your childhood that awakened this love for history and artifacts and change in consciousness about how we're looking at those artifacts? Can you hear me?
Can you come back again? I lost you a bit, sorry.
Okay, so my question was, how come you chose this direction in life? You know, was it something in your childhood that awakened this love for history and artifacts and museums and cultures, you know, and also the strive for change in consciousness, how we look at those things, how we classify them?
I was losing you. So my interest in history, archaeology, I'm originally from Zimbabwe. So growing up, I used to like historical narratives and historical studies. I did archaeology. That's my first underlying degree. So Zimbabwe has got some impressive archaeological sites. I mean, beautiful sites, archaeological sites, pre-colonial archaeological sites. So when I was undertaking some of my earlier researches of archaeology, my first degree, I fell in love in trying to understand material culture, or objects that you call them, artifacts, not just as objects, but as representation of people, right? Because when we do archaeological excavations or anthropological work, we normally think about it from a very scientific perspective, right? It's a science. We're doing archaeology as a science practice. I was speaking around the idea of, you know, the love for archaeology, the love for anthropology, my inspiration in studying and understanding materialities. It's more about the ethnographic aspect. The people, we think about objects as materials, but they're not materials as per se. They're representing people's living cultures, right? So a decolonial work in anthropology or archaeology would entail collaborating with communities whose cultural objects you're trying to study. There's more value in bringing different perspectives of knowledge, different ways of doing and knowing. Almost important, they're equally important compared to your scientific understandings of materialities. So I come from an aspect where I think about biographies, social histories of objects, and how we can work together with communities in redefining and rethinking the meaning of materialities. So museums have for a long time been complicit of just collecting and amassing people's cultural objects without even knowing the meanings underlying the making of these objects. So we're reorienting our practice as museum curators by bringing communities onto the table and allowing them to have a voice on how they want their living cultures to be represented in exhibitions, for example.
Okay, there is one question in the Q&A portal, and I'm just going to read it out. Forgive my ignorance, but have you reached out to museums, etc., in Morocco, Tunisia, Algeria, to see if they recognize any of the items you showed as from their heritage?
Thank you very much for that question. We haven't, that's the truth. And part of this, and I'm thankful for having had the opportunity to present the work for this festival. What we want to try and do is to, beyond just reaching out to the continent, to Morocco, to Tunisia, we want to start by engaging diasporians in Manchester who might have knowledge around this material, these living cultures. And from then onwards, we can now take the question to these countries, because for sure, we don't even know whether some of the objects that I've shown you are from Morocco, because there are question marks around Morocco. So at least if we can still we have a conversation around these materialities with people with interest in Manchester in the UK, then we can reach out to colleagues on the continent to check whether they know these material cultures. But thank you so much for the question. And that's part of the work that I intend to do in terms of reaching out to colleagues in Morocco or colleagues who are even in the UK who might have Morocco heritage or who have interest in Morocco cultural heritage. So together we can try to understand where exactly these objects came from and how perhaps they're still being used in everyday activities within communities in Morocco, Algeria, or Tunisia, for example, or part of the Middle East region. So it's a call for action. Apart from me being the curator, I wouldn't say I know everything about 35,000 ethnographic objects. Right? It'll be a lie for me to profess that kind of knowledge around everything. That's where co-curatorship, co-production, engaging with communities comes into play in terms of democratizing the ways in which we care for people's cultural objects in museums.
Hello, Jabu. Thank you so much. I've got a question. It was delightful for me to learn that Manchester Museum is committed to returning, repatriating the objects over the centuries from different countries. You know, that's what they're committed to from what I gather from your presentation. What I want to know is, can you mention some of the objects that are in the pipeline to be repatriated or have been already returned from Manchester Museum?
Thank you so much. So in 2019, we returned 43 sacred, and ceremonial objects back to Australia, to 6 communities in Australia. Much of these objects were very, very sacred, very, very ritualized, and they were categorized as men's only business, female only business. And they included boomerangs, they included magic sticks, they included magic dolls, also included back paintings. So we have returned before. So we also not planning, but we've engaged with another community in Australia called the andtheir last year, as I said in my presentation, and they have since submitted a request to have the material back. For now, I can't really disclose how many they would want to have back, but we have got a claim that we're working over right now for a possible repatriation of another group of sacred material back to Australia this year. Then we've got the Nigerian example, the Benin bronzes. In our collection, so we've got 19 positively identified material from the Benin loot, 19, including the task. So all of these 19, after a proper engagement with diasporians, Nigerian diasporians, and the Oba, the king. So the Benin kingdom is still present in Nigeria. So we're trying to work with the kingdom itself to try and facilitate the returning of these cultural objects to Benin. Because the Benin bronzes, there are many bronzes. There's also ivory tusk material, like the one that I showed you. There are bronze material as well, which make up the Benin cultural material. This would be returned, hopefully, to Nigeria as part of this unconditional repatriation exercise that we're currently advocating for at Manchester Museum.
Thank you so much, Abu, for that very, very detailed answer. And there's another comment I've seen in the chat. It's from the same lady, Jamila, who asked the question in the portal. She says, very interesting talk and very interesting approach. And she says, how could we help?
Thank you so much, Jamila. I would really want your help. So I think the organizers, if I can share my email address, I don't know how people can reach out to me. I'm in Berlin right now, but I'm back in Manchester on the 2nd of July. I'm open to people coming through the museum. I'll show you the materials. We can start thinking it together, what you know, and then we can perhaps track some collaborations and see how much we can do in terms of the research work. So I can share my email, my contacts, and all that. And if you have time, if you're in Manchester, come through the museum, we'll organize a day. I'll take you to the collections, and then you can see what we hold and start thinking together the kind of collaboration that we would have over this material culture.
Thank you again, Jabu. I'll hand back to Katarzyna in a minute. I have a comment. This session is part of our Festival of Museums and Libraries. I just want to remind our attendees, we have another session as part of Festival of Libraries coming up probably later on, which is not mentioned in the chat. It's from Dubai. There's a Dubai new library there. I've actually visited it and it's beautiful. And on the 7th floor, they have a museum where they have all these amazing artifacts. So guys, if you are here around that sort of time, please do join us and you can see amazing artifacts from Dubai. So Katarzyna, back to you if you've got any question to ask. Otherwise, we'll call it a day. It's a lovely sunny day here in England. And I'm sure people want to go for a walk or go shopping. So any other question, Katarzyna, or any other comment, Jabu, before we finish? Or somebody, yeah, can we have?
Because I've got this list of journals and books, you know, you contributed to, you wrote. Is there anything you could tell us about them? Anything more, you know, if somebody's researching or looking for specific things, where would you direct that person to?
All right, so thank you so much, Katarzyna. So those journals and those books that I wrote, my first book was around decolonizing objects from African museums, because I spoke earlier on about the history of museums and how in Africa, you know, museums are still very much colonial because they're formed as a result of colonization. So museums in Africa are also still grappling with how to decolonize themselves. So I looked at my work at Mutare Museum some years back before I was appointed to be curator of living culture. I used to work in Zimbabwe as a curator for 10 years. So I was writing about the different kinds of curatorial engagement that I did with communities that constitute part of decolonizing the museum. And that the other work is also around, you know, collaborating with communities in rethinking the meaning of material cultures in museums in Africa. So for me now, the question around research is on the biography of objects that we have in Manchester Museum. How do we start thinking about the stories around materials, not the material themselves? What kind of collaborations can we have with communities in redefining and rethinking the meaning of anthropology or anthropological objects? So it's not so much about the anthropology as a category, it's about the meanings, the stories underlying the objects, because objects are made to be used, not to be put in a glass case in a museum. Right? So how do we move away from the anthropological obsession of things and things, the aesthetic obedience, to aesthetic disobedience? It means we are moving away from the gaze. We gaze at things that are beautiful, But behind the beauty, the beautiful bow that you saw there, it's beautiful, it's lovely, right? Very beautiful, but there's no story. What is the story? So that's what I'm really interested in understanding. So I'd rather call myself a curator of stories. I love to create stories than the objects. The objects are nice, lovely, beautiful, but they don't mean anything. They're just sitting there like that. So that's where I came into play in terms of thinking about this bowl, these cups, not just bowls and cups, but there's living cultures, because there are stories that must be told about use, rituals, ceremonies, and all the intangible heritages that were part of the process of making the objects themselves.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. I love this approach. My background is in holistics and arts in health, and also in mental health. And absolutely, I can relate to that, to incorporate the person and the story and who they are, what they have gone through, what they've created, you know, and what can they create in the future. It's absolutely incredible that all those people from different backgrounds have this underlying theme of, you know, using understanding and empathy and being curious about the, you know, the facts, not just like dead objects, you know, or laws that don't mean anything.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for being here today. So thank you everyone for joining us. Do join us tomorrow, same time on Zoom, for Muslim women in Australia. And please do look on Eventbrite for our upcoming events. And if you are around in Manchester on 1st of July, join us in the Lowry. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you.
Jabu. Thank you, Katarzyna and Steve. Well done. Bye-bye for now.
Bye-bye.
Yeah.